In this tutorial, I'm showing you how to make a very fancy color picker that you see here. This is possible in SwiftUI now thanks to the newer features introduced with iOS 17, which is scrollPosition, so I can finally know which position I am. So on here I have a grid of color blobs and I can just move around and pick a color. I track my position and I can also show the selected color. Additionally, I added here some fancy visual effects, obviously, because why not? This is a quite fancy color picker. You can also use the default one, which in iOS usually is showing in a sheet. So here you also have a grid where you can select a color or from the spectrum or from the sliders. But in terms of making a more fun, user intuitive design, this is probably pretty cool. In addition, we're starting actually with an easier version of this, not just a two-dimensional grid. You can also just do this in a vertical scroll view and scroll through here. So we start with this one because it's a little bit easier in setting it up. You can, for example, use this as a alternative to a picker with the wheel picker style. Let's get started with this fun challenge to create our own custom color pickers. I created a new project. You can find a link for the full completed project in the description box. Now, I want to first actually show you the default color picker. In the content view, I use the color picker. You have the arguments for title and selection. The selection is a binding to a color. So pick a color. And then because it's a binding, I need a state property. State private var selected color. This is a color. And initially we just start with blue. This I can then pass as a binding to my color picker. You can now see the default styling of this picker. On iOS, it's a sheet. In compact mode for picker or date picker, you have the possibility to further customize this. Like here, this is the palette, wheel, or segmented. But for color picker, we don't have anything for this. So this is the only styling option we have with the default color picker. Okay, now let's implement the other styles. The first one was with this wheel picker style. Wheel color picker view. I use a scroll view for this with the default vertical direction and for each with range of 0 to, let's do 10 colors, index. And here I can create a color has quite a few initializers. I don't want to go too much into detail into color theory. The one that I want to use, because I want to just show different colors like blue, red, this is the parameter to use for this. The easiest one is actually hue. This needs a double. And the hue needs to be, is a variation from 0 to 1. If I use here the index itself, that goes from 0 to 9. So what I do is I use the index and then divide it by 10. And actually I should go from 0 to 11. The saturation, I want to have very bright colors, so I put 1. The brightness is also from 0 to 1. If you put 0, it's black, and if it's 1, then it's the brightest. These colors, for example, if you set the accent color with this color wheels, this is the hue. They use here degrees. You can go through all the colors and it's changing. Then the saturation, this would be just white, and this would be super bright. And if you change the brightness, it goes from pure red to black. So if you use the hue to move through, we see here we go through all the colors in the spectrum. This is the same one they use in this wheels on the outside, or here in this spectrum picker, it's this direction. Probably should go also here. You see it's the same color spectrum, just in the vertical direction. So by using the hue, I can easily generate from a range, a color range. And this is the range of these colors. Maybe I go a little bit higher and put 20 colors. So we have a more variety. Color theory is really quite difficult. If you're new to this channel, you might not know, but I studied actually physics with a specialization in photonics and optics. And we had a little bit about color theory. Also LED displays and this kind of stuff. So I'm not going to make this more complicated than it has to be. Okay, now going back to making this pretty. I have now here my 20 colors because they are in the scroll view. They are now really narrow. This is because these colors are stretchy views. They don't have an intrinsic ideal size. And the scroll view and the scroll direction will want to use the ideal size. And if the views don't have an ideal size, it falls back to, I think, 10 points. So that's why they're really only that small. In the horizontal direction, the scroll view doesn't shrink these views, so it just uses the maximum values, the maximum width. So what I'm going to do is just set a manual height of 20. Okay, now I set up all the options that the user could choose from. And the next thing is, I actually want to be able to select something in here. So we are using the new scrollPosition with ID and anchor. The ID is a binding to a hashable value because it needs to compare its values. Binding means it's two-way. Basically, this is actually what I want. I want to also be able to set the color, programmatically change the ID, which changes the selected color, which changes the scroll position here. But I also want to track what the user does. So I need to have a state property to track the scroll position, which is my selected color. At state private var selected color index, because I actually only have here the index right now. This is a int optional nil selected index. I want to also show this value somewhere. Let's embed the scroll view in a VStack, so I have some space to put it. In a HStack, saying in a text, you selected color. Again, I need to use the same representation, which means I actually prefer to make this view here reusable. So I add this here as a file private struct color raw, which is a view. Now I move these parts with the color definition over there. It wants to know the hue value. This is now a little bit tricky of what values you keep. Let's just use the int, so I can use this here. I used here 20 color stops. We can also make these as a separate property if we want to later make this adjustable. Number of color stops int 20. Okay, now I can use this here for my color raw with this hue value, which is the index. And then I want to also use this here with this hue value, which is my selected color index. This is optional and here it's not. So let's just add a if let selected color index. Then I do this. Also, because I don't want to have some layout inconsistencies, I use color.clear index. Now, if you try to scroll, you don't see anything. This is because there's one more thing missing, which is this scroll target layout modifier, which we need to add here. I can't use this kind of modifier around the for each, also because I want to have some customization. I use a LazyVStack with spacing of 1 around my for each. And now the scroll target is applied to the ScrollVStack. Then the other thing that I also need to do sometimes is just adding the index as an ID. So usually, I don't know, sometimes it doesn't like it. For each with range will apply automatically for each of these views a certain ID, which is this index or the number here. In this case, I had to manually do this. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky. But now if you scroll, you see that down here, this is moving. Let's just add a frame height of 100. So this is not super big. In order to get the right scroll position, I need the scroll position modifier, the scroll target layout, and you need to identify each of these views. Otherwise, the scroll view doesn't know which ID to use. Now, the other thing that I actually want to do is I want to, instead of here this nil value, not having anything in the beginning, I want to set a certain value. There is another newer modifier, which is default scroll anchor, but this is you can only specify a unit point. What I wanted to do is I want to say the view with this ID is actually the ones that I want to have selected and set. So I could change my state property from nil to one value like 1. You could also use an onAppear to set this. Maybe you pass these values and you need to set it at some point. Now it's 10 is the middle one. I find using the onAppear is probably a little bit better. Then next I want to actually see which of these views is the selected one. So we need to add a little bit of a box to make this visible. Now you can add an overlay or any other styling to say I want to have a rectangle with a stroke colored blue and a line width of 3. But I only want to do this actually if for the selected index. So if the index of this current one is the selected color index or the hue value, then I'm showing here this, and maybe let's use black because I have here blue colors, and this needs to be actually if the index is equal to the selected color index. Okay, now you see here one black border, and when you scroll you see it moving. The reason why it's on top is to understand which positions you're looking at. I'm going to add a little bit of styling, like an aspect ratio of 1 with a content mode of fit. You can also use a frame. Then I want to add some padding. So before the scroll target layout, I add padding. Now the scroll position uses per default the top cell as the one position to track. As you see here, it always uses the first one. It always highlights the first one, but I actually want to use the center one. And you have for this another argument to say, yeah, the tracked one, the scroll position, should be the center one. This is unit point, so you can use leading, trailing, bottom, whatever you want. Now we highlight the center one. And you see I can identify, it's this color, which is also shown here down below. It is overlaying a little bit with my border. This is because the Z index going like this. So in this, for each, the Z index, the way they are stacked on top of each other, the ones that come in this list first, they are behind, and then the ones that are below are coming on top. That's why I have here a little bit overlay from the next one. Here, this one is overlaying. You can use a Z index of saying, similar to here, if this row is the selected one, then I use a higher Z index of 100, and otherwise it's just 1. I can just use 0 and 1, it's also fine. Now you see it's not overlaying here anymore. This is looking a little bit nicer. Okay. The next problem is I can only select the ones that are in the center. And that's because it's not over scrolling, which means I need to add a little bit of space on top and on bottom. So before and after the for each, I need to add some white space. So I can add here a color dot white. How do I know here the height? This is a little bit tricky because I used here the aspect ratio of 1. So here for this aspect ratio I used 1. But in this case, because it's only supposed to be half on top and bottom, I know it's supposed to be, so it needs to be 2. So if I scroll up, you can see I can go until this position, and I can do the same below my for each. So it goes until here and until here. So this area is just with an aspect ratio of 2, so it's 2 times the width and the height. Okay, this is looking good. We can now select everything. And the last thing that I want to do for this specific case is actually add a little bit of a color of the picker style. That's typically used for the wheel picker style where it fades out on top and bottom, so it becomes more transparent on top and bottom. And we can use the visual effect for this. This is also a newer feature. You get the empty visual effect is basically the view, so the content itself here, this raw, and the proxy, the geometry proxy. Geometry proxy is similar to a geometry reader, same idea. I get the information of the scroll view, how much did I off scroll, for the cell, the position, the size of the scroll view, all the cool stuff. What I need to here return is the content. And you can apply different modifiers like contrast, brightness, blur, offset, or opacity. This is the one that we wanted. For example, I can make this half transparent. This value now I need to calculate depending on the proxy, because the proxy has the information for the scroll view. Let's do this in a separate function because it's a little bit of calculation involved. This depends now on how much you're used to Geometry Reader. So this is func opacity for proxy, which is the geometry proxy. And we are returning here, I think, opacity takes in a double. Yes, it's a double. So I return here directly a double, starting with returning here 1. Okay, now some parameters that you can get is the scroll view height. This is in the proxy bounds of scroll view. This is now the size, which means you get the height. It's optional. I just make this 100 to have something. I don't know why it's optional. Okay, next, the raw center position. So basically, which gives us the off scroll, the position in the scroll view, asking the proxy for frame in a coordinate space, and the coordinate space I care about in this case, this local global, is the scroll view. So I want to know the frame, the position of this raw in the scroll view, because this is giving me the frame. I have information of the minimum x. This doesn't really make sense in this case because I only scroll in vertical direction. So I only care about y. I could use the minimum, which would be the top edge of this cell, the center, or the maximum, which would be the bottom. I am going to use the mid y. So this tells me the edge from the origin on the scroll view, so this is the top leading edge, how much downwards in the scroll view is this cell. In this case, I actually want to know more like how far this cell is away from the center, because the more away it is from the center of the scroll view, the more opaque I want to have it. And then if it's in the center, if the distance is 0, I want to make this opacity 1, so it's fully visible. So we are going to calculate the distance from scroll center. I have the scroll view height divided by 2. This is the center position minus the raw center position, y position. This is because you see here this minus. This is positive and negative. I only care about the distance, which means I prefer to have the absolute value. Now I know how far away we are from the center position. And what I have to return here is the opacity, which has the range from 0 to 1. When my cell is in the center, I want to return 1 for the opacity. If I'm furthest away, I want to return 0. So I need to normalize here this distance from center by the scroll view height. So I say 1 minus the distance from center divided by the scroll view height divided by 2. So scroll view height divided by 2 is multiplied. So this now is a value between 0 if it's in the center and 1 if it's at the very edge. And we are complaining because, let me see if this is working if I use here double instead. Okay, I have now calculated my opacity that I want to use here in my visual effects. Opacity for proxy. And indeed we get these opacity gradients. If you want to test this one time, you can also replace here our specific colors with one color like pink. Now it's a little bit easier to see. I really have here this opacity gradient. On top it's fully transparent, in the middle it's fully visible, and on the bottom it's again fully transparent. So we can scroll view nicely. This is now the first example where I used the newer scrollPosition modifier to track the scroll position in this view. It is very important that I have here the correct identifiers for each of these views, so the scroll view knows what ID here to track. And it needs to have the same types for the ID and here my state property. I additionally to use the scroll target layout to make this work. And the rest was more fancy stuff like this visual effects or here my overlay, just to add some styling. I will now continue on this more advanced example where I use a grid, and you already saw me discussing that I need to identify each of these colors properly. Before I just used an integer that I could use to convert to a color. In this example, the way these color dimensions work is in one dimension, I want to have the brightness and saturation. So in this direction, and in the other direction, I'm going to use the hue. So you see, I go for all the spectrum in the colors. We need to track the ID. We need to track these colors, and you need to create here data that I can use for my grid. So first we need to discuss the data model. I would like to use color, but color is not identifiable. I don't know why they didn't do this. So let's make it simpler and create our own custom color. I'm just putting this here for this project. This is a custom color. I need to make this identifiable and hashable. Hashable because of these ID properties in the scroll ID. Now similar to color, I want to have a hue. Now these should be, I'm directly using the proper values types, which is CG float, saturation, CG float, and brightness. In order to create the identifier, I add a UUID. Okay, this is enough for working with my for each. Next, I actually need to have the data to show my grid. So I add here a static func spectrum that generates me a custom array of custom color type. So for now, let's start simple with hue of 0.5, saturation 1, and brightness 1. For this grid, in order to get this grid layout, I'm using a LazyVGrid. And in LazyVGrid, you give a for each with all the elements, and the VGrid automatically distributes them over these lines. You would think I need to pass in a two-dimensional array because two-dimensional grid, but it's actually because of the LazyVGrid. It needs to be a one-dimensional where we move over all the parameters that I set. I'm going to make this rather fast. So first I define a brightness distance. Brightness is in the horizontal direction. And hue, we're going in the other direction. So this is 0.05, which means I have 20 values. Then I need to create the steps. And I use array with stride for this. So I create an array from stride going from 0. I said color goes from 0 to 1. 0 to 1. And the distance that I use is here this brightness distance or the hue distance. Now we have one more value that I can use, but only two-dimensional array. And the half until here, I'm varying over the brightness, and the rest is actually the saturation. That's how I make it actually here white. Okay, because I need to here fill this array, I use a results array. So I can insert more of these values with my custom type. Then I use a for each for the hue values. That's because you saw that in the vertical direction, I want to vary over the hue. So I go over the hue values that I have. Additionally, for each of these rows, I need to now insert another array or sub-array section where I vary over the brightness values. So this is the row where I go over the brightness values and I map them because I need to transform them here to my custom type, my custom color. So first is the hue value for this row. The saturation is 1 and the brightness is $0, so it's the value that I had here in these values. Now I can use these values and append contents of my row. And then this is the results array that I actually here return. Now this would be the first half of my color grid. And I also needed to add here the variation for the saturation. So in this case, I use for the brightness, and then I vary over the saturation. Okay, you will see how this looks like once we have something to show. Okay, now going to my view, I have to track the selected color again. This is a state private var. You can also make this a binding later on if you want to reuse this. State private var selected color. This is custom color optional. Then I need to have all my color options that I generated with the static function spectrum. And now we finally can actually work on the UI. Again, I need to use a scroll view. You saw me being able to scroll in 2 dimensions. So I use the axis, which is the axis set. So you can define here horizontal and vertical. In here, I want to use a LazyVGrid with column spacing and content. I'm going to stick here with this fixed one for now, so we have something to do. I use 0 spacing. The content of my LazyVGrid is this color options. So I use a for each for my color options, color in. Now I can use these to generate a SwiftUI color view from my custom types hue value to my custom values types saturation and brightness. These are now giving me some color gradients. The main reason is here because I used fixed and only one value in this array. Okay, we have to change this and generate I use array repeating with a grid item of fixed because it's a LazyVGrid. This is the height of 20. The count needs to now fit here the distance that I used. So I go from 0 to 1. I know you can make this more customizable by calculating the proper distance so you have certain elements. So I use here 0.0 in the horizontal direction. I use distance of 0.1, but twice. So we should be at 22 elements. Then this grid item also has a spacing property. To zoom in. So you already see here in the horizontal direction, I go from black to bright. This is because I modified in this array the brightness. And in the second half, it goes from white to fully colorful. This is because here I modify the saturation. The only thing is, this is inverse. These items I need to append in the reversed order. So I need to use here a reversed. And the other thing is, I actually here have one color twice because I end with 1 and this, and the next one that I start is actually exactly this one. I basically just want to get rid of the first one. So I drop the first value. So now in the middle, it doesn't have a double value. But you see this funky effect. That's because I think I need to change this number now to 21. Okay, this looks better. If you don't want to really follow here all my calculations, you can just go and look at the final project that I link in the description. Okay, now comes the more fun part of actually working with these views. I want to have here square elements, and that's why I create here a property color size, CG float of 20. I need to use this for the cell height, for these grid items. And also I need to style this here with these views. This is frame, height, color size. Maybe let's do 30. So we have something to scroll around. Similar to before, now I want to track the position of my scroll position with the selected color. So first we need to use the scroll position with a binding to my selected color. Again, I want to use the anchor of center, otherwise I would use the top leading edge. To make this actually properly work, I need to use the scroll target layout modifier around my LazyVGrid. And let's just see. I'm going to show the final color below. So I use a VStack, similar to before. HStack, text, you selected. And then I need to get here my color view, my color data, so my selected. If I have something, I show the color, the selected colors, hue, saturation and brightness. If you try it doesn't track it, it's probably need to check if it's the ID again, color. Yeah, it is. And I add here a frame height of 20. Initially I have here nil, but I want to just have one of these colors. Because I only generate them here, I use the onAppear to say the selected color is the color options count divided by 2. So I just use the one in the center, so it's somewhere here. I use one of the center ones. Now I also want to actually highlight this, similar to before. I had here an overlay. So around my color view, I check if my color is the selected color. And you see it appears. Let's use white. Again, I have here this problem with the z-index. So I can also do the z-index. If this color is the selected one, then I have a higher index than otherwise. Now this is nicely shown. Instead of the overlay, we can also use a z-stack, because then it's just a little bit easier sometimes. And I move this rectangle behind the color, and we're actually using a fill, which means now they have the same size. So I make it a little bit bigger by adding a negative padding of -3 or 5. So now we can easier see where this is. Again, I have the problem that I cannot scroll to the edges, so I can't select something there. In this case, because I use here LazyVGrid, I just want to add some padding of 100, 350. This is now 2 different values in horizontal and vertical. What I'm going to do again is use this aspect ratio trick. You can also use something else, so 1 and fit. If I use something like 170, it does work. I probably should use something different. Maybe use a geometry reader outside of the scroll view to calculate how much this is, to be able to reuse this in different situations better. Then our picker here now works, but I want to make this a little bit more cool looking. So we're adding again this visual effect. You can add a visual effect to any view in your scroll view to modify, for example, the opacity. Let's say I want to do the same. So around my z-stack here, I add this visual effects, and again I need to have this function. And in this case, I was doing this gradient from top to bottom. So now you see it's going in and out. I don't really think it's a good idea to use here this opacity. I rather use a scale effect. Now it still does it one direction, and I need to actually do it in 2 directions. So when I go away from the center, I need to scale it down and up. First, I actually rename this function because it's not opacity, is scale amount. In addition to here, the scroll view height, center position in Y direction, I also need to do this in X direction. So this is the Y values, distance from center Y with the row Y value. Then I copy this and reuse this to have the width, so the scroll view width, the scroll position X, which is the mid X, the scroll view width, the scroll row center position X is the distance from center in X direction. Now in here, I can also use this and say if you are going away from the center in X and in Y, scroll view width. This is a little bit too high because now I go minus. So I just remove this 2. What I did now is in the central it's 1, and to the very edges it's scaling it down to 0. Because here I go full. If you want to go only a certain amount, you can, instead of going here this whole, multiply this part by an amount. Okay, this is then plus. Multiply, maybe you only want to go to 50% at the edges. So now they're not so small at the edges. You can also say in the center it's a little bit higher, like 0.2. Okay, maybe just 1. Now the testing part starts. Okay, because I go smaller, I can go higher. Okay. Last, what I added was a little bit of shadow, so you can add here a shadow of 1. Zooming in to see the full glory of this animation. Although you probably need to look at it at the device if it actually makes sense, if you actually see the difference. So now this is moving. In the demo that I showed you, I actually added a corner radius that I need to add to these views individually. And in this case, I can actually use a rounded rectangle with corner radius of 5. You can play around with this. It really depends on what sizes you want to use for the squares, how much you want to have the offset. But I think this is fun enough. Right now it's cutting out the overhang with the scroll view. But if you want to also make it like fill out the whole screen, you can use the scroll clip disabled true. So now it goes for the whole screen, also with this one on top. So you could use, okay, let's add a background with a thin material. So this is on top. And then maybe we're moving this one down. So now you go through the whole array. I'm going to undo this because I actually like the previous version better. At this point, it depends a little bit more where you actually use it in your apps in combination with the other views that you have. Okay, this is it. A rather long tutorial. If you made it to the end of this tutorial, well done. I like this example because it highlights very nicely what you can actually do with ScrollView. Now with the addition of this scroll position, this visual effect, the important point to track the position is using here the scroll position modifier to the scroll view, adding the scroll target layout, and then also very important, adding the identifiers to your views. If you had a static view inside of the scroll view, you can also add other identifiers of the same type, obviously. That's the thing, you need to have the same types everywhere, otherwise the scroll view can't pass this properly around. For this example, the bigger challenge was actually getting the colors right by going through the hue, saturation, and brightness. If you want, you can use this component now in your own apps. You just need to here use a binding instead of a state property. Other use cases for scroll position is, for example, if you have here an image gallery and you scroll through this, you see every time I scroll in the preview grid, the overlay changes, so I know where I go. You can also tap here, and then this scroll view moves to this position. This is fairly straightforward thanks to this scroll position. More advanced is you can also sync multiple scroll views together. This is a little bit tricky because sometimes it doesn't want to. Similar to before, I have here on the top this scroll view, and on the bottom I have another scroll view for this preview images. If I now scroll to the next section, you see the lower part also moves. And the same happens in the other direction. For this, I need to track these two scroll views separately and then use an on change when one of them changes, when the top one here changes, to check like, should I move the other one? Should I programmatically scroll the other scroll view? Because I touched quite a bit on visual effects, I also want to show you some cool things that you can do with visual effects. For example, parallax effects, where here I calculate an offset for these text and title here. So I offset them more depending on how much I scroll. So they're moving differently than these cards. I also added a little bit of offset to these images. So they are moving also a little bit in their frame. This is more subtle. You see here this balloon is moving in this frame. Another parallax effect is if you have a background image and a scroll view on top, and you only move the background image slightly when you go through the scroll view. So you see the image is moving behind. There's quite a lot of things possible with these visual effects. These are some of the examples I also shared on Twitter, so you can also follow me there to see some more updates of smaller projects. These whole examples I made for my new course for SwiftUI layout, so you can also check it out and find the link in the description. You can also get the book with all the code and explanations. Please like this video. If you found it fun, let me know in the comment section if you think this kind of colors or special pickers, if you actually would use this kind of pickers in your new project, or if you prefer the default ones. Thank you for watching. Until next time, happy coding.